over there. What time is it with you?
It's 8 o'clock now here.
Right. Well, I hope we aren't disturbing your evening too much. For this episode of Southbank Live, we shall be discussing one of your predictions, actually, for the future, Nickolai, which is that more lockdowns are incoming. Before we get to that point, however, I would like to just do a little bit of housekeeping here. For anybody who is watching this live, do feel free to ask any questions or leave any feedback in the comment box. We do have one comment so far. Richard says hello, good morning. Well, actually, good afternoon, Richard. Now, as we have passed into the afternoon, hope everything is going well with you. And of course, for anybody who's watching this as a recording, this will be going live. This will be saved onto our YouTube channel shortly after it has been recorded. Feel free to leave any comments in the comment section below, because we do read those. We shall be using them to inform future episodes of Southbank Live. Now, look, Nickolai, on to you. How are things going in Japan? Because the Japanese response to coronavirus has been quite different from our own in a lot of ways. Could you enlighten us? Tell us what the Japanese response has been and whether or not it's worked.
Yeah, whenever anyone asks me about Japan, I always explain that nobody who really explains things about Japan understands them very well. And I think the highlight of that really struck home for me recently was that I saw a chart, I think on Bloomberg, of the level of travel restrictions that different nations have been under over time. And they've got a line for each different country. A high point on the chart is very restrictive for travel, and a low point is not restrictive of travel. And Japan was very high on the chart. Which is simply not true, according to my own and my immediate and extended family's traveling. So it's just a signal that I think it's very difficult to understand Japan. And whenever you think you've got a grasp of it, the data says something different. So I'm really hesitant to comment, but I can tell you that the Prime Minister's resigned. So it's all about to change once again. So far, though, it seems to me that Japan has done very well. The reason why is a bit of a surprise, actually. And I believe it's because the Americans helped them write the Constitution way back in the day. And that Constitution guaranteed a very high level of human rights, what the government could and couldn't do. And one of the things that it can't do, the federal government at least, is impose a lockdown. So they haven't had a lockdown. Now, that said, there has been some local sort of semi-voluntary lockdowns, and there's been some restrictions and constraints that have come into play. So it's not really clear how restrictive Japan has been. It's also not clear what level of compliance with restrictions and what level of sort of compliance with voluntary requests from politicians the local Japanese people have actually acted upon and what they've actually done. So, for example, a funny one that made me laugh a lot was in most countries, when there was a COVID outbreak in the city, people would ask their children, grown-up children, adult children, come back home to where you grew up and come and live with us. Yep. While this pandemic blows over. And lots of my friends in the UK went and did that. They'd go and live back with their parents or whoever it was, or rent a cottage back in a less populated part of the UK.
Yep.
Well, in Japan, the family elders told their children, don't come back from the city. Don't save yourself, because if you are the one who spreads COVID to this town, the family won't be able to live it down for the next few centuries, and will always be the ones who brought COVID to the local. So, for example, when my sisters-in-law came to visit us, which is fairly often, it's top secret. We don't tell anyone, and it's a bit of a disaster if anyone spots.
Don't spill the beans live on air, Nickolai. I hope nobody.
Well, of course, they've been seen, so it's but that's so everything's so different here that it's incredibly difficult to get a grasp on it. But so far, it's been quite successful, by many measures. Another odd quirk that I think is worth mentioning is that the hospitals are very much privately owned here, and when the government tried to take over the hospitals in anticipation of a COVID wave that never arrived, they discovered that under the Constitution, they're not allowed to do it. So once again, there was this panic about, we don't have the hospitals, and the hospitals, because they're private, won't accept the COVID patients. Once you've been infected, the hospital will just say no. But again, that didn't really play out. So because the COVID wave hasn't been that bad. So there's lots of interesting things about Japan that I don't think you can generalize or learn from, to be honest, because it's just Japan's so different.
Yeah, there are so many anomalies and just general differences that one wonders whether or not investors can really learn lessons from Japan when Japan is just so much different. Our mutual acquaintance Tim Price likes to say that Japan is the dress rehearsal and the world is the main event. And I do wonder just how much of Japan's past is in our future when it comes to their lost decade and the amount of quantitative easing that they've done and things like that. But Nickolai, just in terms of interestingly, this week, of course, we have had the resignation of the prime minister in Japan. We've also seen some interesting action in the Nikkei, which seems to be breaking out at the moment. What would you think is behind that? So the Japanese stock market, it's still nowhere near where it was in the late 80s, of course, but it is a very interesting stock market to look at, and it's had a very good week. What do you think is going on there?
I don't know about on the week-to-week basis, but the general idea is that Japan's incredibly undervalued, and then it should benefit from this idea that the made in China boom has run its course and costs are rising in China, and then there's the political crisis, the geopolitical issues which you and I focused on a lot, and all of that together should benefit Japan because it's got that manufacturing base, that high tech base, and as these disruptions in supply chains and geopolitics get worse and worse, the Japanese firms should stand to benefit from that. But yeah, on a week-to-week basis, I'm not sure. I know that people don't believe that stocks go up in the long run in Japan. There's not that belief that you've just got to buy and wait long enough. So that has always been a really fundamental difference. But people are quite reluctant to talk about these things. I know there's a bar in Tokyo that the theme is a stock picking bar. So every cocktail's got the name of a famous investor or whatever it is. And but that's the only time I've seen any sort of indication that people in Japan are like people in the US or the UK, where they like this speculative, investing in the stock market world. And that's even stronger for property. People just don't do it.
Right. I do notice you've got a bit of a cough there, Nickolai. You wouldn't happen to have the Wu flu, would you?
No, I've got what's called an atopic cough. Which basically just means I don't know what it is. But supposedly, my Japanese doctor claims that his senpai, which means mentor, discovered this and declared this a unique form of cough. So I'm getting the medicine, and it had been working for about a week, and now the cough is back conveniently for Southbank Live.
All right. Well, hopefully it won't interrupt with proceedings too much, Nickolai. But I think we should proceed a little more onto our main event, because recently you told me that you think we're going to go back into full lockdown all over again. We're not talking about partial stuff. We're talking about the whole shebang that we went through last year, where all the pubs and restaurants just get shut, and there's a huge amount of restrictions on everything. And you see this as, just as we were saying earlier, that, Japan is the dress rehearsal and the world is the main event. Would I be correct in thinking you think that Israel is the dress rehearsal and the world is the main event when it comes to lockdowns?
Yeah, and that's actually the claims that the Israelis have made, both going into what was going to be a great vaccination success story, and then also during. There's a lot of Israeli doctors and health professionals that are commenting, saying that this is a warning for the world. What could happen here can happen anywhere. Those sorts of comments. And I think what people really need to understand, which hasn't really dawned yet, although the Daily Mail did start to figure it out today, funnily enough, is that we know COVID sort of waxes and wanes and there's these waves, which means if one nation has a success where the vaccination rates are very high and thereafter the cases fall, that might be because of vaccination, or it might be something else, right? It might just be the natural waxing and waning of COVID. Whereas it only takes one country to have a failure with the vaccination in order to disprove the idea that the vaccines are either going to reduce case loads, reduce hospitalizations, reduce deaths, or reduce lockdowns, whichever one of those measures you want to focus on. Everybody disagrees on what the word works means for vaccines. That's not what we're focusing on here. My point is that it only needs one country to have very high vaccination rates and still have either the lockdown or the cases explode, or the deaths or the hospitalizations, whatever measure you want to choose. Because if the vaccine hasn't worked in that one case, that disproves that it will work. And that's a very different dynamic to saying, oh, the UK had high vaccination rates and then cases fell, it must be the vaccine, right? So it's falsifying the hypothesis by having vaccines fail. Now, the earliest signal we had was the story of Seychelles, and I wrote about it in Fortune and Freedom. The idea that they had very high vaccination rates, very small country, and it was about the story was about which vaccines they'd used. And that was the excuse for why cases had exploded there. And the deaths and hospitalizations didn't follow. And I wrote saying this could be a warning sign. And then it happened in Iceland as well. And the issue with Israel is that they have had deaths and hospitalizations follow, and they have had record number of cases.
Yep.
Now, that I think that yesterday or today they've reported double the previous peak. It went from about 10,000 to 20,000 or something like that. So it's a huge difference. And wherever you think this domino of the vaccines will stop cases, they won't stop cases, but they'll stop hospitalizations. They haven't really stopped hospitalizations either so much, but it'll stop deaths. Well, the deaths ticking up now. The one that I want to focus on, especially in this video, because we're looking at the financial story, that's our focus at least, is whether or not it prevents a lockdown. And I think it's quite clear from the Israeli story that the case loads and the hospitalizations and deaths are bad enough, not a disaster. The vaccines are working, they are making an effect, but that nevertheless, even with a high vaccination rate, there will be more lockdowns because the vaccines are just not good enough to prevent those lockdowns. And then that springs up all of these economic and financial trends that we usually talk about, but COVID will be the trigger for those again. And I think that the most interesting angle of this is what's happening in Australia right now, which might sound completely irrelevant to the readers and the viewers. But think about it like this. The state of Queensland hasn't really had COVID rip through the population. They've had some cases amongst the travellers that came into Queensland and would go into the COVID hotels, the quarantine hotels. So the state of Queensland is this place where COVID hasn't happened yet. Now, what would happen in the state of Queensland, hypothetically speaking, if they reached 70 or 80% vaccination, whatever your target,
yep,
and they opened up and they allowed COVID to go through the population? What would happen in that scenario? And I think that would be the petri dish experiment of whether the vaccines do work and how well do they work. We would actually find out, and we would actually learn a lot from that. I'm not saying that that's what we should do, but that's the interesting thought experiment here. For example, if they opened up after 80 or 70% vaccination rates, which is what they're talking about now, and Queensland experienced a huge amount of cases, huge amount of hospitalization, huge amount of deaths, then we would know the effectiveness of the vaccines. If there was very few cases, very few hospitalizations, very few deaths, we would then again know that the vaccines are working quite well. Now, at the moment, the federal government in Australia is saying once we hit 70% vaccination rates, the states must open up. They made that agreement when the number of cases was very low in Australia, and the states agreed. Now the cases are very high in New South Wales and Victoria, two of the southern states, and Queensland and Western Australia have said, no, we're not opening up at 70 and 80% anymore. They've reneged on the agreement because they said the modeling that suggested we should open up after 70% is that we won't have that many deaths. And the Queenslanders and the West Australians are saying, now that we have lots of COVID cases in Australia, if we did open up, there would be huge amounts of deaths and it would be a disaster, right? Which is really interesting because it suggests that the vaccines work when there isn't a lot of COVID, but they don't work when there is. So there's all sorts of inconsistencies that are being exposed by the situation in Australia. That are also, I think, suggesting, along with the evidence from Israel, that COVID is going to have a few more waves. The vaccines won't be enough to prevent lockdowns, and we're still stuck in this cycle. Even if it's significantly less bad and there's less deaths and less hospitalizations because of the vaccines, that won't be enough to prevent the vaccines. It's just a hypothesis, a theory, and it's been updating as lots of evidence has been coming in from Israel. So, for example, I think just 3 or 4 or 5 days ago now, there was a top Israeli official who said cases are falling, the R rates turned because of the vaccinations, everything's going to be fine now, and then the opposite happened. So obviously, as this goes along, everybody so far has had an opinion on COVID, and I think everybody's been wrong. But I think this is a particularly interesting one because of that thought experiment with Australia, where we start to think about what it is that matters as we try and use vaccines to try and end the pandemic and also the lockdowns.
It does put the the politicians in Queensland into something of a catch-22 or a COVID-22, I guess you could say, where, if you open up, if you're hesitant about opening up, then it implies that the vaccines don't work. And yet, if you do open up and then the vaccines don't work, you get all the blame for it. So if you're a politician who maybe secretly believes that the vaccines aren't so effective, if you comply with federal law, then you're going to get an awful lot of heat for it. And so, yeah, I definitely would not want to be a politico in Queensland at the moment who's going to get, who's going to get the hit for whatever happens next. But Nickolai, if you're thinking there are going to be several more waves coming and then more lockdowns, do you think that this is going to cause a response in markets the same way that we saw in 2020? So maybe if it's a surprise that there are more lockdowns, we'll see a big liquidity squeeze. And then after that, because tech is the only game in town where nobody's allowed to do anything, we just see some ridiculous boom in the big tech stocks, maybe some of the smaller ones like, well, not Zoom isn't even that small anymore, it's pretty big now. But then, stimulus checks in America, which would inevitably happen in the event of another lockdown, cause another speculative surge in all these, meme stocks and things like that. Crypto carries on blowing up. Is that what you would expect to happen again? Or do you think that we'll see a different brand of market response in the event of another lockdown?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. And I think that's a tough question to answer, because some stocks, for Zoom, for example, as the pandemic ends, you might expect it to fall back to some lower level, given that our use of Zoom or whatever it is falls back to some lower level. But if the pandemic continued on for longer than expected, it would just elevate it back to that level it was at. Now, some stocks, such as the ones that are especially addicted to QE and monetary and fiscal policy, because they get another boom, might boom higher. But for the most part, as a generalization, I think we've had that boom to the extent that it's possible to have it, because this is a continuation of what caused the initial boom. It's not a new level. There's loads of constraints to that theory, though, because if, for example, inflation continues, then can the monetary policy continue alongside that because of COVID? Which of the two considerations, which one outweighs the other? The fact that they need to support the financial system, or the inflationary effects of just messed up supply chains and just the general inflation that we've seen and the unemployment issues. How much more debt can governments take on realistically? And what does it do to the bond market if central banks are buying up ever increasing amounts? So I think this is similar to the issue of the euro, where it becomes an interesting political crisis rather than a financial and economic crisis, because the extent of the financial and economic crisis is very extreme and very strong. It doesn't make sense to do what's being done economically and financially, but there is still political will for it. And so my attention, if there are a further series of lockdowns, would be on the growing protests, the growing political opposition to lockdowns, growing political disruption. In Australia, there's some protesters, the truck drivers are protesting. And I think that would be where, one of the interesting questions I've often wanted to ask readers and viewers is at what point they would join those protests. How many lockdowns would it take? I think actually Melbourne's or Sydney set a world record for the longest lockdown in the last few days. How bad would things have to get for people to join those protests, given that when there's I don't think there's any political party suggesting to end lockdowns no matter what. They're all saying, at least I think they would change their mind if they are, once cases and deaths grow, which is what's happened in Israel. So I think that you would have to focus on the political pushback against lockdowns if this would just keep on continuing, because another way of saying this is that we'd have bigger problems than the financial markets and stock markets. At least I think that the political problems would become stronger and more important. I don't know if a new variant would be an exception to that. If we get a new variant that's more deadly or more transmissible, whatever it is, does that then give them a good enough reason to continue this whole lockdown process? I don't know. It'd be interesting to do a poll, I guess, of readers to say if there was a new variant, would you comply with further lockdowns? But it baffles me that people have gone along with them to the extent that they have, especially in Australia, where there's been a lot of stories getting a lot of press of bizarre consequences from lockdown policies. Children getting caught on the wrong side of the border without their parents and things like that. And that's within Australia. The sports teams and their wives and girlfriends and families are allowed to travel across the border, but a child that needs emergency surgery at the hospital that's just on the other side of the border cannot go. So I think people are getting quite angry. So maybe a politician would start to listen to that, but I don't think so. And I think that clash between protesters effectively and politicians will become where people should start to focus more so than financial markets. What it does mean for financial markets, I really don't know, because it's likely that the pandemic causes the financial and economic overdose that we've spoken about so often, even before the pandemic. So then it becomes a situation of what do people worry about more, inflation or a pandemic, which is bizarre question in and of itself. I guess people face that after World War I as well. So things are getting so bizarre that all of the historical relationships that we used to understand no longer hold. It's a similar sea change, I think, to when QE began and good news was bad news and bad news was good news, where we used to say, this would mean this for the financial markets. Those connections might no longer apply. And it becomes incredibly difficult to answer the question that you asked me, what happens next?
Well, that is the question that we do try to ask here at Southbank Investment Research. Nickolai, so many different corridors we could go down on what you've just said there. Some very interesting observations. But you did say you wanted to ask our readers and our audience. So if you are watching this live, or indeed if you're watching a recording of it, do feel free to say, how many lockdowns would it take before you would start to get interested in protesting its existence, or perhaps you are protesting already. However, that is obviously a very sensitive topic, and on YouTube you may have you may be commenting on your real name and have a work email address that is related to you. So I completely understand if you would prefer not to comment on something like that, especially when you see the kind of response the government may levy against people who do protest lockdowns, because the longer we carry on with these things, the less interested people are in carrying on with them as well. And as a result, you may expect the government to become a lot more forceful when it comes to trying to enforce these lockdowns. Now, we have had quite a few comments in the chat here, generally on the topic of the Wu flu and the vaccines. Graham, good afternoon. Graham says he thinks more lockdowns. He's sure all part of the World Economic Forum agenda, the Davos lot. Glad you're waking up. Shame you didn't realize recently you got COVID from the vaccine. Nickolai, have you been vaccinated? Is that where your cough has come from, do you think?
No, it's not. I haven't been vaccinated yet. I've just recently received a letter that I'm eligible to book my spot. So yeah, that's coming up. I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet. I'm still sitting on the fence. My theory so far for myself personally has been to wait for quite a while to see what the studies say, what the research says, whether they work or not, whether a new variant comes out that blows the whole vaccination thing out of the water. But I think you won't believe this when I say it, Boaz, but as soon as some sort of government restriction that impacts my life comes along that says you need to be vaccinated in order, for example, something to do with my daughter. For example, if I have to be vaccinated in order for my daughter to go to childcare or something like that, I'll just get vaccinated. And the theory behind that for me is that the risk of COVID is very small, and then the risk of the vaccine is probably very small as well. And it's very difficult to know which one's more risky or less risky, adjusted for all the different things that's why I don't know how to adjust for age and other risk factors and all this sort of thing. And if something comes along that is an immediate problem where there's no probability, there's no the risk of this is very small, the risk of this is very high. It's just an immediate problem where if I don't get vaccinated, then there's some sort of problem that I've come up against, then I'll just get vaccinated because it's not worth whatever the immediate problem is. And those very small risks of either getting COVID or not getting COVID or whatever the vaccine reduces the chances of getting COVID are, all of that's very small, low probability in my mind. So the social and immediate problems that I face from not being vaccinated will persuade me to get the vaccine. And that very much walks into what the governments are trying to do, doesn't it? Because they're trying to pressure people to get vaccinated by making life difficult for the unvaccinated. But I think that works, quite frankly. I think it works and it's very effective. And I'm just going to wait as long as I reasonably can until something like that comes along. Conveniently, Japan, I probably won't even realize when it does come along. So I won't understand what the restrictions are. But so far, at least, they've been quite slow with the vaccine passports and things like that, especially compared to some of the things you're hearing about Australia. So yeah, that's my own situation. I think it's a pretty odd one.
Yes, it is. We are treading quite a thin line here. I am very conscious that YouTube and its parent company Google, they're very interested in cracking down on misinformation and disinformation about COVID. And of course, we are focused on financial markets here, so don't want to go too sort of down certain rabbit holes regarding vaccination and things like that. Though, of course, we have got plenty of comments about it, so it is kind of hard to dodge it. The whole point of Southbank Live is to respond to the audience in real time. David, good afternoon, David, says, look, it's very simple. The virus is transmitted via air. Until this is addressed, the vaccine, hands, face, space protocol will never work, says the WHO. An EPA tested and proven solution exists. Chris, good afternoon, Chris. Thank you for commenting here. Biggest misnomer in history. It is not a vaccine. It is a symptom reduction jab. A vaccine prevents a patient from getting a disease, i.e. measles, mumps, etc. COVID jabs are not a vaccine. This is something I was wondering about the other day, because if you can still get the Wu flu and you can still pass it on to other people, one wonders, why is it? How can it be a vaccine? But I'm no physician, so I'm sure the official definition would allow that to be included. But I do wonder whether or not people are relying on using the word jab now instead of vaccine because it's not working quite so well as a vaccine. But that's just me.
When someone that I work with for my Australian work is Jim Rickards, and he's claimed recently, and I don't know if this is true, that under the specific legal definition in the US for a vaccine, the COVID vaccines don't fall under that, perhaps because of the reason that the viewer suggested. But I don't think that really matters. And also, I think the idea that you can still get COVID and you can still pass it on, and all of that, I think is not so important in the sense that if it did stop you from getting COVID, then great. If it didn't stop you from getting COVID, but it stops you from passing it on, then great. It doesn't stop you from passing it on, but it stops it from being bad, then great. So whichever of those three it is, or to whatever extent of those three it is, isn't really the point. The interesting part of this is that those dominoes have been falling, and they're falling in a line, right? At the beginning, it was you won't get COVID, and then it was, well, you won't pass it on, and then the dominoes are going. That's what makes Israel so interesting, is that the next domino is falling. And I think that is a more important trend to follow. I was listening to a podcast or reading something recently where they compared it to when an airline delays your flight. They don't say we're delayed by 6 hours. They say we're delayed by 20 minutes, and then 20 minutes time, we're delayed by another hour. And all along they knew it was going to be 6. So it's the same general idea. And that's part of the fact that the COVID machine and the lockdowns just continue. The other interesting angle on this is that the Swedes supposedly at the beginning of the pandemic sat down and said, what is the sustainable level of COVID measures that we can implement, given that COVID's going to be around for however long? And that I'm not saying that that's what they implemented. I'm not saying that's what they actually did, or I'm not saying it succeeded or not. I'm not saying they didn't make other mistakes. Yes. But if that was just as an idea that we're going to only implement a level of COVID measure that is sustainable, say economically or whatever it is socially, what would that level be? And we still don't seem to know that. But that seems to me where it'll end up. And the fact that we don't know it yet is interesting. But to me, that's what we should all be focusing on, is what is the highest level of restrictions on our lives to try and fight the pandemic? Maybe we don't need any, maybe we need a high amount, I don't know. But what is the highest level that is sustainable when we try and weigh out the deaths and the risks with the economic damage and the social issues? And of course, that is what we do with all other diseases. And that is what we do with driving cars and speed limits and what we do in all other aspects of our lives. We outweigh the risk every day of, the risk of me getting hit by a car and dying is there, but I've still got to get food from the grocery store. So I'm still going to cross the road. Every day we make these trade-offs. We haven't done that for COVID, partially because we didn't know the information we needed to know, but we still don't. That's the part that's bugging me here. And so we're no closer to figuring out what the sustainable level is. Now, if that is, you get vaccinated, and then because of that, the risk is very low, so we can completely open up, which is what politicians are promising for a long time, then that's what we should do. But I don't think we've figured it out yet. And it's been a long time. We've been through a long way through this pandemic. And I noticed, just to add to this, I think Sweden has blocked travel from Israel. So the pariah state of COVID, which supposedly refused to implement any policies, has blocked travel from the first large nation to have whatever rate of vaccination it was. That's the vaccination success story. And that tells you that we're still in this COVID phase of nobody knows what's going on.
Yeah, again, there are so many corridors we could sort of take from that. It is interesting with the Swedish approach. I was there last year. It was very refreshing to be there personally after being through the pandemic the response to the pandemic in London during 2020. I do wonder if I'll actually be heading back there the way things are going, Nickolai, though it isn't as easy as it was before. We are getting there's a fair bit of comment on this in the chat. I got worms says that's pathetic. I don't know exactly what he's responding to, but I got worms. Thank you for your contribution. Policy objectives is from Chris. Again, policy objectives should be based on healthcare institutions not being overwhelmed. These jabs accomplish that to a large extent, but do not reduce the spread. Is now the time for herd immunity? So I think that ties into a bit of what you were saying there, Nickolai, with just it depends on how much people are prepared to cope with the existence of this thing, rather than trying to nuke it out of existence and lock down until it is nuked out of existence.
That question is based on assumptions. Maybe it's the right question to ask, right? But my point is that we don't know any of the information accurately enough in order to even know whether it is the right question to ask. So, for example, I think it was 2 days ago, the top German newspaper story in Bild Zeitung, which I think is the biggest tabloid in Germany, basically was about the fact that the German COVID statistics I think it's on one of the vaccines, on the death rates of one of the vaccines or something like that. It was a number salad, they call it, Nummernsalat, right? It was a complete mess. And the government had admitted they don't know how valid the numbers are, right? They don't know whether the numbers that the policies are based on are accurate. So if you look at the healthcare systems not being overwhelmed, that hasn't happened. I don't think it's happened anywhere definitely not on any significant scale. So some people would say the lockdowns prevented the healthcare systems from being overwhelmed. Some would say the vaccines have. Some would say neither of those two would have made a difference. And my point is that I think we've got scientists who understand data making all three of those claims, each different version. And I don't think there's any consensus on just any question regarding COVID at this point. I think there's debate and for every scientist who says things one way, there's a different one who says it the other way, and they both claim the data makes them proves them correct. And one of the biggest claims that I've made right through the pandemic, and I think this cannot be repeated enough, especially to people who don't read foreign newspapers, is that in each different country, the national leading epidemiologist, the one who's involved in policy making, or be it a group, they all say they're following the science, right? They're basing their decisions on the latest science, and the policies they're implementing are based on that. But they're all doing something different, right? No two places have got the same. I think it was in Queensland, 1 minute they were saying that there's no evidence for this policy working. I think it was curfews. Next thing they did it, right, within a few weeks. So the idea that we even know which questions to ask yet, I don't think has been established. And part of that's because of how bad the data is. Now, that really annoys me because we should have good data by now. There was a Bloomberg article on this recently along the lines, I think the headline read, the vaccinated people are worried and the scientists can't help. The scientists can't explain to them what the answers are. And the idea was that if you look at the studies that are coming out about COVID, they've been of a ridiculous quality. One was a 4th of July party where thousands of people had gone, half were vaccinated, half weren't, and they followed up. That's a ridiculous the idea that we're basing, or they based national policy decisions on that. I think it was about masks. They reintroduced masks because of Delta. As a result of this study about a party. I mean, that's ridiculous. We should be tracking everyone. We should know what's going on. And the studies should be about, you know, a nation as a whole, or something much bigger than a 4th of July party. That's what I think Israel gives us. And I think it's also what Queensland gives us, or could give us, is a big enough data set where it's not about how many percent effective is Pfizer? Is it 89 or 39? Or was it 17? There was, how quickly does it wear off? There's 1,000 gazillion questions like that. How fast does it wear off? Who is not vaccinated at this point? Is it very vulnerable people, and is that why the unvaccinated are dying? We don't know any of these things, and so we haven't used this data collection properly in order to find out what the right questions are. But I think Israel tells us that all of that mixed into one nation, all of those questions, all of those challenges, and Israel happens to have very good data, but still, once you throw everything into a box and say, will vaccines get us out of lockdowns? I think the answer has been no, based on Israel's evidence. And I think that's been the closest we've had to decent data on being able to answer that question. And I think Queensland will prove that way too. And I'm concerned that there will be significant political consequences if Queensland does open, or is forced to open, because it's currently looking like there'll be some sort of high court case about it. And if there are lots of deaths, and the death rates are comparable to what's happened in other places before, that there'll be absolute hell to pay.
You think that following, so if we we go further through that scenario in your head, do you always think it means more lockdowns, or do you think it means people try and go for some kind of herd immunity, free for all? Do you always think that it's going to lead to the same sort of repressive response, or do you think someone might try to flip it around and do it differently?
Yeah. Well, this is again another good example of the fact that we don't know, because I remember the definition of herd immunity was conveniently changed at one point. It used to mean everyone gets the disease, then it meant everyone gets the disease or gets the vaccine, and then it meant just the vaccine. And now the vaccine can't prevent herd immunity because it's not effective enough at preventing spread. So now we're back to herd immunity means everyone gets the disease. Right? So imagine having a conversation with someone or yourself 6 months ago. The terminology and the assumptions that you would be using wildly different. Each word has meant something completely different. So there was a good meme about how the people with 3 jabs are turning on the people with 2 jabs in Israel. Right. So now 2 jabs is no longer considered vaccinated. You've got to get 3. Yeah. So none of the terminology or the numbers or the way the numbers classify, all of that has completely changed. And it's changing more and more often, faster and faster, I think. So it's a bit of a mess. But to get back to your question, whether or not they call it a lockdown and what the restrictions are, I've got no idea. What I will say about that is that maybe lockdowns are a great idea. Maybe vaccination's a great idea. Maybe opening up and going for herd immunity by letting the virus rampage through the population. Maybe doing everything on a voluntary basis. I don't know. But what I do know is that whatever policy we come up with, the government will find a way to screw it up. Right. So, for example, Sweden supposedly didn't implement any restrictions, but they sent a load of, my understanding is they sent a load of people who either weren't tested or did have COVID to aged care facilities to try and protect hospitals from being overwhelmed. And that's about as dumb a thing as you can do, but it happened all over the place. I think it happened in New York. I think it happened in Ireland, where I think it happened in one of the states in Australia, where the priority was to protect the healthcare system, as the viewer was saying. That should be the priority. But that just leads to a mistake elsewhere, because the government just gets these things wrong. And I think that let's call it a rate of error, needs to be included in any government policy that we're proposing. And I think once you do that, once you adjust the fact that whatever the policy is, the government's going to find a way to screw it up, then you realize that all of the more draconian policies are going to have bigger disasters, suicides getting out of control, and COVID deaths might be lower, but deaths from lockdowns will be higher. So and then the less invasive government policies will have less of those sorts of problems. And I think that needs to be factored in. I don't think epidemiologists factor it in. I definitely don't think politicians factor it in. I don't think anyone does. We've all got these opinions about what government should do, but no one ever thinks about, well, given the success rate of government policy in the past, which is, as far as I'm concerned, zero, but I'm sure everyone will give it some sort of rate of success. But once you adjust for that, I don't think any of them make any sense. And I really don't know what the answer is then, whether everyone should just protect themselves and you do what you think is right, or whether there is some good idea of government policy. I don't know, but it's a lot easier to point out why things don't work and how they haven't worked than it is to say, well, then what should we do?
Right. James says that, James comments, thousands dying from this jab and millions with catastrophic side effects. Why is it forbidden to talk about this? The Great Reset is happening. Now, I'm generally quite dubious, quite skeptical of the Great Reset idea that this is a global coordinated response in order to achieve some nefarious later goal, rather than governments not wanting to send mixed messages in what they perceive to be a crisis. But what's your take on that, Nickolai? Because when you're looking at the whole Great Reset idea, I mean, it certainly is something that a lot of politicians have spoken about. You can't deny that somebody wanted to make this a thing, the Great Reset. This is an opportunity to rebuild the world and right all of the wrongs, etc., etc., etc. I mean, do you think there is anything to that?
The Great Reset's wonderful because you can ascribe to it whatever you like. If there had been no pandemic and something else had happened, people would say, oh, that's a sign that the Great Reset is occurring. Central bank digital currencies, for example. And what I understand by the Great Reset is probably completely different to what you do and what each of the viewers as well. I think most of the signs that we've seen of the Great Reset can also be seen as incompetence. So the fact that they all use the same Build Back Better slogan might be a sign that there's some sort of evil government plot. I think it's just a sign that they don't know what to say and they're just going with a default slogan. And I don't think that they really understand. Also, you've got to remember that who they spend time with, who these policymakers, politicians spend time with, they're going to see any crisis as an opportunity.
Yeah.
The fact that they're willing to say it in the open is a really stupid thing to do. Again, I think it's just them being idiots. Also, yes, historically speaking, a crisis is when things change, but that's just when a reset happens, a currency reset, for example. But that's just how the world changes inherently. The reason currency resets, where the way the financial system and trade functions, the reason those have happened in the past is because things got so bad that people were willing to accept a change. So, and it's almost like a pressure valve blowing up, where everyone points at the pressure valve, but really it's the pressure that's the issue. So I don't think that it's as nefarious as the Great Reset makes it sound. And I think it's a lot easier to explain with public choice theory economics, which is the idea that most of us think in terms of institutions. The Bank of England wants this, or the Tory party wants this. The public choice theory's key idea, as I understand it anyway, is that there is no institutions, it's all individuals. And if you look at each individual's incentives, you can anticipate how they behave. And I think how the people who are being accused of the Great Reset, how they've behaved is easily understood if you look at what the incentives they face as individuals. If you try and think about the World Economic Forum, then yeah, it looks very nefarious and strange. But if you look at what the individuals in the different positions in different parts of the government, what they're trying to do, why they're trying to do it, I think it's much more about individual politicians being ambitious, or I'm thinking of trying to think of a nasty comment about how they've all been caught with their mistresses. That it's much more those sorts of desires that are deciding their how they make their decisions than a Great Reset or something nefarious. If there is something nefarious, it'll be something to do with money. It'll be a way to profit from this. I think the scandals in the future will be about who owned the companies that made the masks, that sort of thing, rather than a deep nefarious plot, especially from the beginning. I mean, to be honest, if they tried to engineer a pandemic, I'm sure they wouldn't be able to do it.
That's an interesting take as ever, Nickolai. There is that quote, I'm probably butchering it, never ascribe to conspiracy what could be explained by incompetence, which I think is sort of sums up your view there. And then Nickolai, there were a few there were a few other topics I wanted to discuss this time around, but we have been somewhat sidetracked. Let's see, just taking a look in the chat. Thanks to everybody for making this such an active conversation that we've had this episode, on episode 10 no less. Vincent says, home deliveries and smartphones still provide a decent workaround during lockdown. Combine lockdown with a telecoms or oil crisis, and people will start leaving their caves. Vincent, that is a very interesting observation, actually. So, we've managed to get by, provided all of the supply chains and so much as all of the internet infrastructure keeps on going. It has been interesting to see the massive boom in cybersecurity stocks during this period, because when big corporations push everyone at home, obviously at home you don't have the same security safeguards that you would have on an office computer, where you've got an administrator taking care of everything. So this creates very rich pickings for hackers. Now, yeah, I wonder how much further lockdowns would then compound the issues we've already seen when it comes to supply chains for basic commodities to manufactured goods of various levels of advancement. Nickolai, do you think further lockdowns, do you think we've actually kind of pushed the system to its limit for how much you can keep everybody at home and still manage to keep all of the the everyday pleasures that everybody in the developed world enjoys going? Do you think we've pushed that to the limit? Because I wonder, if we did do another lockdown, as Vincent says there, how much disruption can things like the global oil industry manage? And how close might we be to seeing some kind of cyber 9/11, where there is a big shutdown on all of this internet? Because I don't think it's possible to maintain things like mandatory lockdowns and curfews and things like that when so many of the sort of basic inputs for a lifestyle in the developed world rely on these things like supply chains, which everybody takes for granted.
And the only really interesting thing I would say in that, where I think I can add something of value, is that the shortages and the toilet paper dramas and the problems that were had, for example, in the gold market, happened very early in the beginning. And then I think after that, for a very long period, despite Brexit, of course, we had a smooth ride. And recently, it's been a lot of issues, with shortages and supply chain disruptions, and and the inflation that's been part of that. It seems to me that when China got itself into trouble with lockdowns, that's when things really took off. And that's when the disruptions really occurred, when China went back into lockdowns. And so I think we've figured out how to deal with lockdowns. But there are some nations in the world who completely lock down, completely and utterly. And I think that is where the disruptions occur. My worries for small businesses, I think they've started dropping like flies in Australia. There's this eviction story in the US where the Supreme Court's ruled that the eviction moratorium cannot be extended, and therefore however many renters it is face eviction now. So there's lots of signs of trouble. I think we've become quite good at dealing with lockdown. So I'm not so worried about that. And also I think the unlocking is not going to be as smooth as many people assume. How many people would rather take an unemployment check and be at home if the choice is between that and going back to work and things like that. So yeah, it would be fascinating to have an expert on logistics in to ask about this. Just like we asked how many lockdowns would it take for people to get out and protest, how many lockdowns would it take for global supply chains to experience a real big issue? On the financial and investment side of this, it's interesting to note that the airline stocks and all the entertainment stocks for the theme parks and things like that, they've survived quite well. There hasn't been any real big busts, which is extraordinary if you think about it. I wonder if at some point those busts would have to happen because the government can't bail out the entire economy. At some point, there's got to be some sort of limit. So I guess that's another trade-off people have got to consider. But like I said, I think it's the political implications are going to be more important. I think the the political system and the level of protests would get out of control before the supply chain issues do. Um, I mean, I would assume that if your shop's bare, you go out and protest, and the protest would be the bigger issue at that point.
Yeah, I think one leads to the other in certain ways, especially if you did get protests in areas which aren't big exporters to the developed world. Of course, in places like China, the CCP can crack down very hard on that. But maybe there are plenty of other parts of the world that we rely on for all manner of imports. So I think one leads to the other either way. If there's going to be sudden shortages of things, you get protests. And similarly, if there are protests in areas which are big exporters, then you're going to have issues in the developed world as well.
One way that could play out is something I've written about, the idea of another Arab Spring, because the food price is rising very fast in inflation, and that would be, in effect, in a wake, the COVID crisis causing something that triggers more supply chain disruptions that get even worse. That's like the China lockdown, where some countries are, they can experience problems that are an extreme form of lockdown, which really would cause a huge issue. And at that point, yeah, all bets are off, and nobody knows what's going to happen. But whether stocks would go down in that scenario, I don't know, because maybe it just suggests even more stimulus.
Yeah, it is a very bizarre world we now inhabit, though it has been bizarre for a long time. I imagine that as Simon Mikhailovich, our acquaintance, very big in the gold world, made a comment to me a while back saying that all that this has done is, all the pandemic and the lockdowns have done is reveal what was really there, rather than, it's not actually what's changed, it's just pulling back the veneer of polite civilized society and just showing what it's really like underneath.
For a lot of people, it's confirmed what they were arguing we should do with the MMT crowd is the one I'm thinking of, that they say the pandemic and the response to it and the success of the response to it is proof that we should have been doing this all along. So if the pandemic were gone tomorrow, I can't imagine austerity being imposed. Although the video I did with Nigel yesterday, he was saying the government is trying to get its fiscal deficits under control. I haven't seen that in the other government around the world.
Yeah, it does seem like politically, it's hard to imagine what the political landscape is going to look like post-pandemic. Maybe the pandemic just lasts forever, and they just carry on going through the Greek alphabet for new variants. Sorry, maybe we'll get the theta variant, the gamma variant, epsilon variant, etc., etc. Yeah, it's hard to imagine a world post-COVID now, but I mean, I guess that's our job if we really want to get an edge as investors. But yeah, it does seem politically in a post-pandemic world, it does seem very hard to imagine that austerity would be popular. It's hard to imagine a Tea Party today, but it was very hard to imagine. It's very hard to imagine a pandemic a couple of years ago, wasn't it? So yeah, I think, Nickolai, you have been very generous with your time today. Are there any closing remarks you'd like to make to our viewers?
No, just we really got stuck on vaccines, didn't we? I suppose it's the most interesting thing to talk about. But yeah, I'd love to hear more from viewers on which particular things struck chords, or good and bad chords, and agree and disagree. Because, like I said, my thinking on this, and I think everyone's thinking on it, should evolve over time. Because so far everyone's been proven wrong, I think, about the pandemic at some point, and so we don't know what's going to happen. But the person that starts to figure it out first is going to gain the advantage that we're really chasing here. So I think it's worth continuously trying to get that edge, and hopefully we've helped people to do that, edge them a little bit closer.
Oh, well, I certainly hope so. Nickolai, thank you so much for your time. And for all those watching, thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching this live, thank you for the comments. It's been a very lively chat box today. And if you're watching a recording of this and you would like to say just how many lockdowns it would take before you'd start protesting, or maybe whether or not you're up for protesting already, do feel free to leave that in the comment box below. If you were watching this on Facebook Live, do feel free to follow our page there. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, please do subscribe. We shall be back next week with episode 11 of Southbank Live. But that is all from us for the moment. Nickolai, thank you so much for joining me.